The blizzard had been raging for 36 hours when Victor Havel's cabin collapsed under the weight of 8 feet of snow, trapping his family inside until Lucas Novak pulled them through a tunnel he'd dug from his fortress 200 yards away. 6 months earlier, those same men had called Lucas a fool for wasting an entire summer cutting blocks of snow and stacking them like a child's fantasy castle. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals another forgotten frontier innovation that saved lives in the harshest conditions imaginable. The snow fell in silence across the Colorado high country on the morning of November 3, 1880. Lucas Novak stood outside the log cabin he shared with Tomas Svoboda, watching the first flakes of the season drift down through the pine branches. The air smelled clean and cold, carrying that particular sharpness that came at elevations above 10,000 feet. Lucas was 32 years old that winter, a Czech immigrant who had arrived in America 7 years earlier with nothing but carpentry skills learned from his father and a determination to build a life far from the coal mines of Pennsylvania. He and Thomas had come to these mountains 2 winters before, drawn by reports of abundant beaver and marten in the remote valleys where few trappers bothered to work. The elevation made everything harder. Water froze solid by October. Snow accumulated to depths that made travel impossible for weeks at a time. The nearest settlement with a store was 4 days' journey on snowshoes. But the isolation also meant the fur-bearing animals were plentiful and relatively naive to traps. In their first season, Lucas and Tomas had taken enough pelts to pay for another year's supplies and save a modest sum beyond that. Their cabin sat on a bench of land above a creek that ran year-round, fed by springs that stayed liquid even in the deepest cold. The structure was typical of what trappers built in those years. Logs cut from nearby lodgepole pines, notched at the corners using the saddle notch technique Lucas had learned from a Swedish trapper the previous summer. The walls were chinked with moss and mud. A single door made from split planks hung on leather hinges. One small window covered with oiled paper let in minimal light. The roof was poles and bark, covered with a layer of sod. It had taken them 5 days to build, working from dawn until dark. It kept out wind and most of the rain. For mountain standards, it was adequate shelter. Thomas emerged from the cabin carrying their breakfast of cornmeal mush and salt pork. He was 41 years old, lean and weathered, with a thick black beard that was starting to show gray. He had left Bohemia the same year as Lucas, but had spent his first American years working railroad construction across the plains. The work had been brutal, and Tomas carried a permanent limp from a dynamiting accident that had shattered his left ankle. But the mountains had been good to him. The trapping work suited his methodical nature and didn't require the kind of heavy labor that aggravated his old injury. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the snow increase in intensity. This was just the beginning. The serious snow would come in December and continue through March. By February, they would be living under a blanket of white that measured depths in yards rather than inches. But for now, it was simply beautiful, and the cabin was warm, and they had plenty of supplies stored for the months ahead. March 17, 1881 arrived with deceptive calm. The winter had been hard, but manageable. Lucas and Thomas had worked their trap line successfully, accumulating a respectable collection of pelts stored in the cabin's small loft. The snow depth had reached its seasonal maximum in mid-February at roughly 9 feet on level ground, then begun its slow spring reduction. By mid-March, perhaps 6 feet remained, consolidated and heavy, with the repeated freeze-thaw cycles that characterized spring in the high country. Tomas left the cabin at dawn to check the upper trap line, a series of sets they had placed along a tributary creek that ran through a narrow valley 2 miles northeast of their camp. Lucas stayed behind to process pelts they had collected the previous day. The work was tedious but necessary. Each hide needed to be fleshed, stretched, and dried properly, or it would be worthless at the trading post. He had worked through the morning, scraping membrane from the inside of a beaver pelt, when he heard the sound. It began as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but thunder made no sense in March. The sound grew rapidly louder, becoming a roar that made the cabin walls vibrate. Lucas dropped his tools and rushed outside. The roar lasted perhaps 15 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had started. Silence returned to the valley, but it was a different silence now, expectant and somehow wrong. Lucas knew immediately what had happened. Avalanche. The question was where. He grabbed his rifle and snowshoes and headed toward the upper trap line at a pace that was somewhere between a fast walk and a run. Travel was difficult. The spring snow had a crust that sometimes held his weight and sometimes collapsed beneath him, plunging him thigh-deep into heavy, wet snow. It took him 40 minutes to reach the narrow valley where Thomas had gone. The avalanche had come down from the ridge on the valley's western side. The crown where the snow had fractured was visible as a clean line across the slope, perhaps 400 yards above the valley floor. The debris field spread across the entire valley bottom, a chaotic mass of snowblocks, broken trees, and rock. The slide had been massive, likely triggered by the warming temperatures and the weight of the winter's accumulated snow finally exceeding what the slope could hold. Lucas found Thomas at the edge of the debris field. The avalanche had caught him while he was checking a trap near the creek. He had been swept perhaps 200 feet down slope and buried under 6 feet of concrete hard snow. By the time Lucas excavated the body using a broken tree branch as a shovel, Tomas had been dead for at least 30 minutes. His neck was broken. He had probably died instantly when the snow slammed him against a tree or rock during the initial moments of the slide. Lucas sat in the snow next to his friend's body and tried to understand what had just happened. Lucas buried Tomas on a south-facing slope above their cabin, where the snow had melted enough to allow digging into the rocky soil. The grave was shallow. The ground was still frozen 18 inches down. He piled rocks over the site to protect it from animals and marked it with a cross made from 2 pine branches lashed together with leather cord. He spoke no words over the grave. Tomas had not been a religious man, and Lucas felt that silence was more honest than empty prayers. The weeks that followed were difficult in ways Lucas had not anticipated. The practical aspects of continuing alone were manageable. He could run the trap lines himself, though it meant longer days and more risk. He could process the pelts and maintain the cabin and perform all the tasks that survival required. What he could not manage was the constant awareness that the cabin they had built offered almost no real protection against the forces that surrounded them. He began studying the cabin with new eyes, seeing weaknesses everywhere. The notched corners were the most obvious problem. The saddle notch technique they had used created gaps where the logs did not fit tightly together. These gaps meant heat loss, but more significantly, they meant structural vulnerability. The weight of snow on the roof compressed the notches, causing the walls to settle and shift. Each winter, the gaps grew larger. Each spring required more chinking to fill the spaces that had opened. The door was another weakness. It hung on leather hinges that were already beginning to rot from moisture exposure. The planks were split from a single log, which meant they had natural grain patterns that would eventually check and crack. A determined bear could break through that door in minutes. A heavy snow load could push it inward off its hinges. The door was a convenience, not a barrier. The roof troubled him most. Poles and bark and sod were adequate for shedding rain, but they offered no resistance to weight from above. Lucas calculated that the snow load on their cabin's roof in mid-February had probably exceeded 2,000 pounds. The structure had held, but only barely. He had noticed the ridgepole sagging under the weight. Another winter of similar snowfall might cause catastrophic failure. He thought about the avalanche constantly. Snow had killed Tomas, not the snow itself exactly, but the failure to understand how snow behaved under certain conditions. The slope that had released had been steep, but not extraordinarily so, perhaps 35 degrees. Similar slopes surrounded the valley. What had made that particular slope fail on that particular day? Weight accumulation beyond a critical threshold. Temperature changes weakening the bonds between snow layers. Time and gravity waiting for the exact moment when resistance failed. Lucas began to wonder if snow could be understood and controlled rather than simply endured and feared. He started paying attention to how it behaved in different conditions. Late April brought the serious melting season. Temperatures climbed above freezing during daylight hours, and the snowpack began its rapid transformation from solid mass to liquid runoff. The creek near Lucas's cabin swelled to 3 times its normal width, running brown with suspended sediment. The sounds of dripping water and collapsing snow caves filled the forest. Within 2 weeks, the valley floor was mostly bare ground, scattered with patches of dirty snow in shaded areas. But Lucas noticed something during those weeks of melting that captured his attention completely. Not all snow melted at the same rate. Snow in direct sunlight disappeared within days. Snow under dense forest canopy lasted weeks longer, and snow in deep shade on north-facing slopes above 10,000 feet elevation barely melted at all. By mid-May, when the valley was showing green grass and early wildflowers, there were still areas high on the shadowed slopes where 6 feet of compacted snow remained, looking less like seasonal accumulation and more like permanent ice. Lucas climbed to one of these persistent snowfields on a cool morning in late May. The snow here had gone through 4 months of freeze-thaw cycles. The surface was hard enough to walk on without snowshoes. He kicked at it with his boot heel and barely made a dent. This was not the soft powder that fell in December or even the heavy, wet snow of March. This was something different, something compressed and consolidated by its own weight and the repeated melting and refreezing of its surface layers. He took out his knife and tried to cut into the snow. The blade sank in slowly, meeting resistance like cutting into dense wood. He carved out a small block, perhaps 6 inches on each side. The block held together when he lifted it. The snow had a crystalline structure, the individual flakes long since merged into a solid mass. He could see layers within the block where different storms had deposited snow of slightly different characteristics, but the layers were bonded together, not separate. Lucas spent that afternoon experimenting with cutting larger blocks. He used his hatchet to chop into the snowfield, creating rough, rectangular shapes. The snow was soft enough to cut but hard enough to hold its form. A block 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 1 foot thick weighed perhaps 40 pounds, and remained solid when he handled it. The cut faces were rough, showing the granular structure of the compacted snow, but the blocks did not crumble or collapse. He carried 1 block down to his cabin and left it in full shade on the north side of the structure. 3 days later, the block remained intact. A week later, it had lost perhaps 10% of its mass to sublimation and melting, but it still held its shape. 2 weeks later, it was still recognizable as a block. June brought the brief mountain summer and the arrival of other trappers returning to the high country after selling their winter pelts in Denver or the smaller trading posts to the east. The community of men working this region was small and scattered. Perhaps 20 trappers spread across 50 square miles of mountain valleys. Most worked alone or in pairs, seeing each other only occasionally when their travels overlapped or when someone needed help with a difficult task. Victor Havel arrived at Lucas's cabin in mid-June, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies for the coming year. Victor was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a booming voice and opinions on everything. He had been trapping these mountains for 6 years and considered himself an authority on wilderness survival. He noticed immediately that Lucas was alone and asked about Tomas. Lucas explained the avalanche briefly, without emotion. Victor nodded sympathetically, but clearly considered the death just another example of the risks everyone accepted when they chose mountain life. Victor stayed for supper, and they talked about the previous winter's fur prices and the prospects for the coming season. As the conversation wound down, Lucas mentioned his experiments with cutting snow blocks and his idea about building a structure using compacted snow as a construction material. Victor stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine belly laugh that went on for several seconds. When he could speak again, Victor asked if Lucas was serious. Lucas said he was completely serious. Victor's laughter stopped. He looked at Lucas with something between pity and concern. Building with snow was what children did, making play forts that collapsed after a few hours. A grown man, a trapper who had survived 2 winters in these mountains, should know better. Logs were the proper building material. Logs lasted. Logs provided real protection. Snow was temporary. Snow melted. The entire idea was ridiculous. Word spread quickly through the trapping community. Joseph Dvorak stopped by in early July and made a point of asking about the ice castle he had heard Lucas was planning. Joseph was younger than Victor, perhaps 25, but equally certain of his opinions. He suggested that perhaps the loneliness of working alone had affected Lucas's judgment. Maybe Lucas should consider finding a new partner or returning to lower elevations where there were more people. Milos Kovar visited in late July with similar concerns disguised as friendly advice. Milos had brought his wife to the mountains, one of only 2 women in the region, and he spoke with the authority of a man who had successfully established a proper household. He pointed out that his cabin, built the previous summer using standard log construction, had survived the winter perfectly well. Why would anyone waste time on experimental techniques when proven methods existed? Lucas listened to all of them and said very little in response. He understood their skepticism. From their perspective, his idea probably did seem foolish, but he had made his decision. August brought Lucas to the high snowfield with tools and a clear plan. He had spent July preparing, modifying an ice saw he had purchased in Denver 2 years earlier. The saw had a blade 3 feet long with large, aggressive teeth designed for cutting blocks from frozen lakes for ice houses. Lucas had resharpened each tooth and adjusted the set, the angle at which the teeth protruded from the blade, to optimize cutting through compacted snow rather than clear ice. The snowfield he selected was on a north-facing slope at 11,200 feet elevation. Even in August, the snow here remained 6 feet deep in most places, deeper in the drifted areas. The surface had gone through 3 months of daytime melting and nighttime refreezing, creating a crust hard enough to walk on. Below the crust, the snow was dense and uniform, compressed by its own weight into a consistency somewhere between powder and ice. Lucas began by cutting test blocks of various sizes. His first attempts were too large, roughly 3 feet by 2 feet by 18 inches. These blocks were manageable to cut but awkward to handle and transport. A block this size weighed nearly 80 pounds and required 2 hands to lift. If he dropped one, it would likely fracture. He needed something more practical. He experimented systematically, adjusting dimensions until he found an optimal size. The final specification was 24 inches long, 16 inches wide, and 12 inches thick. A block these dimensions weighed approximately 45 pounds. Lucas could lift it comfortably with 2 hands, set it in place, and maintain control throughout the process. The proportions also worked well for stacking. 2 blocks placed end to end measured exactly 4 feet, which would become his standard wall thickness. The cutting technique required precision. Lucas would first score the snow surface, marking out the block's perimeter with light saw cuts. Then he would make vertical cuts down to the desired depth, working slowly to keep the blade perpendicular to the surface. The rough texture of the cut faces was intentional. His experiments had shown that rough surfaces provided better mechanical grip between blocks. When he had tried smoothing the faces with a flat blade, the blocks slipped against each other under pressure. The rough, crystalline texture created thousands of tiny interlocking points. After cutting the vertical faces, Lucas would make a horizontal cut at the base, working the saw blade parallel to the ground to separate the block from the snowfield below. This was the most delicate part. Too much force, and the block would fracture. Too little, and the block would remain attached. He developed a feel for it, sensing when the block was ready to be lifted free. He extracted his first complete block on August 9, 1881. It measured exactly to specification and weighed 43 pounds. The faces were rough and crystalline. The block held together perfectly when he lifted it. He carried it 20 feet and set it down on level ground. It remained intact. He had his building material. The site Lucas selected for his fortress was a quarter-mile from his log cabin on higher ground with clear sight lines in all directions. The location was deliberate. He wanted visibility of approaching weather or threats. He wanted drainage, so melting snow would not pool around the foundation, and he wanted to be far enough from his old cabin that neighbors would have to make a specific journey to observe his progress and offer their mockery. He began construction on August 15th. The foundation was critical. Most mountain cabins sat directly on the ground, which meant they settled and shifted as the earth beneath them froze and thawed. Lucas wanted something more stable. He spent 3 days preparing the site, removing all organic material down to bare mineral soil, then creating a level platform by cutting into the slope on the uphill side and building up the downhill side with rocks and compacted earth. On the prepared foundation, he laid his first course of snow blocks. The blocks came from the high snowfield, carried down one at a time in a canvas sling he wore across his shoulders. Each trip up the mountain and back took roughly an hour. He could transport 6 blocks per day, working from dawn until exhaustion forced him to stop. The work was brutally hard, but Lucas had discovered that the physical exhaustion helped him sleep without dreaming about Tomas buried under avalanche snow. The first course established the perimeter. Lucas had designed a rectangular structure 20 feet long and 16 feet wide, interior dimensions. The walls would be 4 feet thick, which meant each wall required 2 parallel rows of blocks with a gap between them. He laid the blocks with their long axes perpendicular to the wall line, so each block extended halfway through the wall thickness. The rough faces touched each other, creating friction that held them in position. Between the blocks, Lucas applied his mortar. This was not traditional mortar, but a slurry of snow and water mixed to a specific consistency. Too much water, and it would simply run off. Too little, and it would not flow into the gaps between blocks. The correct mixture had the texture of wet concrete. He would apply it liberally between each block, filling all voids. Within minutes, the slurry would begin freezing, bonding the blocks together. Within an hour, the bond was strong enough to support weight. The corner construction was unconventional. Instead of simply butting blocks together at right angles, Lucas overlapped them in an interlocking pattern. Each corner used 4 blocks per course, arranged so that each block extended past the corner point and into the adjacent wall. The result looked crude, with blocks protruding from the corners, but the interlocking created structural rigidity that simple butt joints could not match. By the end of August, Lucas had completed 3 courses around the entire perimeter. The walls stood 3 feet high, and the structure's outline was clearly visible from his old cabin below. September brought the first serious cold snaps, nighttime temperatures dropping below freezing and staying there until mid-morning. The seasonal change worked in Lucas's favor. His mortar slurry froze faster and harder. The blocks he cut from the high snowfield were denser, compressed by the weight of summer melting that had refrozen into nearly solid ice. The construction accelerated. By mid-September, the walls stood 6 feet high. The double-wall design created a cavity between the inner and outer rows of blocks. Lucas filled this cavity with loose snow, packing it firmly to create additional insulation and thermal mass. The technique was similar to what stonemasons did with rubble-filled walls. using cheaper material in the hidden interior while maintaining structural integrity with the outer faces. Viktor Havel visited in late September with Joseph Dvorak and Milos Kovar. The three men stood 30 yards from the construction site, arms crossed, watching Lukas work. They did not offer to help. They did not ask questions about his technique. They simply observed for perhaps 10 minutes. Then Viktor shouted loud enough for Lukas to hear clearly. He called the structure Novak's Ice Castle and suggested that by next summer it would be nothing but a puddle. The other men laughed. They mounted their horses and rode away. Lukas continued working. The mockery bothered him less than he had expected. Perhaps because he had anticipated it. Perhaps because he was too exhausted at the end of each day to care what others thought. Or perhaps because he could see his fortress taking shape and knew that it would work regardless of whether anyone believed him. October brought the design element that would make his fortress visually distinctive. Instead of building the walls to a uniform height and topping them with a simple roof, Lukas created crenellations. The technique came from medieval castle architecture, alternating raised sections called merlons, with lower gaps called embrasures. Lukas's version was functional rather than decorative. The raised sections provided wind deflection, breaking up the airflow that would otherwise create pressure on a flat wall. The gaps allowed him to observe the surroundings without exposing himself fully. Each merlon was 3 blocks high, measuring 3 feet from the top of the wall to its peak. The embrasures were 2 blocks high, creating a 1-foot difference in height. The pattern repeated every 4 feet around the perimeter, giving the structure an unmistakable fortress appearance. From a distance, it looked like something transported from medieval Europe and dropped into the Colorado mountains. Up close, it looked like exactly what it was, precisely cut snow blocks stacked with engineering precision. By the end of October, the walls were complete. The structure stood 8 feet tall at the embrasures, 11 feet at the merlons. The snow blocks had taken on a slightly blue tint, the characteristic color of dense ice. The fortress dominated the hillside, impossible to ignore, impossible to mistake for anything ordinary. The door required materials that snow could not provide. Lukas had learned carpentry from his father in Bohemia, and those skills served him now as he began integrating wooden elements into his snow fortress. He spent the first week of November cutting and shaping pine planks, selecting trees carefully for straight grain and minimal knots. Each plank was hewn to 3 inches thick and fitted with tongue and groove joints that interlocked when assembled. The completed door measured 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, weighing nearly 100 pounds. The door frame presented a unique engineering challenge. In traditional log construction, the frame was simply notched into the wall logs. But Lukas's snow blocks could not be notched without compromising their structural integrity. His solution was to create the frame first, then build the snow walls around it. He constructed a rectangular frame from 8-inch thick timbers, mortised and pegged at the corners for maximum strength. The frame extended 18 inches into the wall on all sides, anchoring it within the snow block construction. As he built the walls up around the frame, Lukas packed his snow mortar slurry extra thick against the wood, creating a bond between the organic and frozen materials. The slurry filled every gap and froze solid, locking the frame in place as securely as if it had been set in stone. The door itself hung on iron hinges he had purchased in Denver the previous year. These were not delicate household hinges, but heavy-duty hardware designed for barn doors, each hinge weighing 5 pounds and capable of supporting substantial weight. The locking mechanism was equally robust. Lukas installed a wooden bar that dropped into iron brackets on the interior, the standard method for securing cabin doors. But he added a second system, a heavy beam that slid horizontally through guides and into a mortise cut into the adjacent wall blocks. When this beam was engaged, the door was not merely locked, but structurally integrated with the wall itself. Opening it from outside would require destroying a significant section of the fortress. The chimney system required careful planning. Heat was necessary for survival, but heat could also destroy his snow walls if not properly managed. Lucas's solution was to build a stone chimney in the corner farthest from the door. He hauled rocks from the creek below, selecting flat pieces that could be stacked with minimal mortar. The chimney rose through the roof in a straight column, narrow at the base and widening slightly as it climbed. This design created draft while minimizing the amount of heated stone in contact with the snow walls. Between the stone chimney and the snow walls, Lucas left an air gap of 6 inches, packed with loose snow for insulation. The heat from the fire would rise directly up the chimney rather than radiating outward into the walls. He tested this design repeatedly during construction, building small fires and monitoring the snow blocks for any signs of melting. The system worked perfectly. Heat rose up the column while the surrounding walls remained frozen solid, their rough crystalline surfaces showing no deterioration from the warmth just inches away. The roof construction began in mid-November as the first significant snows of the new winter started falling. Lucas had debated several approaches before settling on a design that balanced strength, insulation, and protection from the elements. The solution combined traditional materials with his snow engineering principles. Heavy timber beams spanned the width of the structure, resting on the top course of snow blocks. These beams were lodgepole pine trunks, stripped of bark, and shaped to consistent 8-inch diameter. He spaced them every 2 feet, creating a framework strong enough to support substantial weight. Across these beams, Lucas laid split planks, each one pegged to the beams below, using wooden dowels he had whittled during evening hours. The planks overlapped like shingles, each course covering the gaps in the course below. This created the first layer of waterproofing. Over the planks, he spread sheets of birch bark gathered from lower elevations where birch trees grew. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible, prized by trappers for emergency shelter and container construction. But Lucas did not trust the bark alone. Over this layer, he spread a mixture he had developed through experimentation, a combination of clay from the creek bank, pine pitch boiled down from sap, and animal fat rendered from beaver carcasses. The mixture was applied warm, spread thick across the entire roof surface. As it cooled, it formed a flexible, waterproof membrane that sealed every potential leak. The final layer was sod, living earth, and grass that he cut in rectangular pieces from a meadow and laid over the sealed surface like tiles. The completed roof was 18 inches thick and weighed several tons. The snow block walls supported this weight without difficulty, the blocks having compressed and bonded into a structure nearly as strong as stone. The multiple layers provided exceptional insulation, keeping interior heat from escaping while preventing cold from penetrating downward. Inside, Lucas built a sleeping platform along one wall, raised 2 feet above the floor. The platform was heavy planks supported by log posts driven into the ground before he had laid the first course of blocks. Beneath the platform, he created storage space for supplies, tools, and equipment. The elevation kept him off the cold ground and provided better air circulation around his sleeping area. Along another wall, he constructed shelves using the same careful joinery he had employed throughout. These shelves held his cooking supplies, food stores, ammunition, and personal items. Each shelf was braced with iron brackets and could support substantial weight without sagging. He carved alcoves directly into the snow walls for additional storage, discovering that items stored in these frozen niches stayed remarkably well preserved, the cold acting as natural refrigeration. The floor remained bare earth, packed hard and level. Lucas considered laying planks, but decided against it. The earth floor helped regulate interior humidity and provided thermal connection to the ground below, which stayed warmer than the air during deep winter. He spread canvas over the high traffic areas to minimize dust and mud. By November 20th, 1881, the fortress was complete and Lucas moved his supplies from the old cabin into his new home. December arrived with temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. The first major storm of the season hit on December 7th, dumping 3 feet of new snow across the high country over a period of 36 hours. Wind drove the falling snow horizontally at times, creating drifts that buried anything less than 4 feet tall. Lucas watched the storm from inside his fortress, warm and comfortable despite the fury outside. The fortress performed exactly as he had hoped. The thick walls moderated temperature swings dramatically. When the exterior temperature dropped to 15 below zero at night, the interior stayed at a steady 32 degrees without any fire burning. When he lit a small fire in the stone fireplace, the interior temperature rose to a comfortable 50 degrees within an hour. The heat did not escape rapidly through the walls as it would have in a log cabin. Instead, the thermal mass of the snow blocks absorbed the warmth and released it slowly over hours. The crenellations proved their worth during the wind events. Instead of hitting a flat wall and creating pressure that could destabilize the structure, the wind broke up against the alternating high and low sections. The design created turbulence that dissipated the wind's force rather than concentrating it. Lucas could hear the wind howling outside, but inside the fortress the air remained calm. The door remained secure despite drifting snow that piled against the exterior. The double locking system meant that even when snow pressed against the outside with considerable force, the door could not be pushed inward. Lucas could open it from inside with minimal effort by simply disengaging the locks and pushing outward. The snow would fall away, and he could step out into whatever conditions existed beyond his walls. Moisture management was the one aspect that required adjustment. Lucas's breathing, cooking, and the small fire all produced water vapor. In a log cabin, this moisture would escape through gaps in the walls. In his sealed fortress, the moisture had nowhere to go. It condensed on the interior surface of the snow walls, creating a thin layer of frost. Lucas solved this by opening the door for 10 minutes each morning, allowing the moisture-laden air to escape and fresh, dry air to enter. This simple ventilation routine prevented moisture buildup without sacrificing heat retention. By late December, other trappers began stopping by to see how the fortress was surviving the winter. Victor Havel visited on December 23rd and asked to see the interior. Lucas invited him inside. Victor examined the walls, the door, the chimney, and the sleeping platform. He asked about interior temperature and fuel consumption. Lucas explained his techniques and measurements honestly. Victor said little during the tour, but his skepticism had clearly diminished. The structure was not melting. It was not collapsing. It was functioning as a legitimate shelter in conditions that tested every structure in the mountains. Joseph Dvorak stopped by in early January and admitted, somewhat grudgingly, that perhaps the snow fortress was not as foolish as he had initially believed. January brought weather patterns that old-timers in the region recognized as unusual. Milos Kovar stopped at Lucas's fortress on January 14th and mentioned that his grandfather in Bohemia used to say certain signs always preceded the worst storms. The animals knew first. Deer moved to lower elevations earlier than normal. Ravens gathered in larger flocks than typical. Squirrels seemed frantic in their movements, as if trying to accomplish critical tasks before time ran out. The barometric pressure began fluctuating wildly, a phenomenon that could be felt even without instruments. Lucas noticed headaches that came and went without obvious cause. His joints ached despite being only 33 years old and in excellent physical condition. The air felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with humidity or temperature. It was a physical sensation, as if the atmosphere itself was preparing for something significant. The sky took on strange colors during sunset, deep reds and purples that lasted longer than normal twilight. Old-timers called this storm light and considered it a reliable predictor of major weather events within 72 hours. The phenomenon had something to do with ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, refracting light in specific ways. But the precise mechanism mattered less than the accuracy of the prediction. Victor Havel rode through the settlement in mid-January, stopping at each cabin to discuss preparations. He had lived through 17 winters in these mountains and had survived the legendary blizzard of 1873, a storm that had killed 6 trappers and destroyed a dozen cabins across the region. Victor said the current signs reminded him of that year. The same heavy feeling in the air, the same animal behavior, the same stormlight at sunset. Most trappers felt secure in their preparations. They had survived previous winters in their log cabins. They had adequate supplies stored. Firewood was stacked and dried. Food was plentiful. The standard preparations that had always been sufficient would be sufficient again. Only a few men, Victor among them, felt genuine concern. Victor stopped at Lucas's fortress and suggested that if the storm turned out to be as severe as the signs indicated, Lucas might consider offering shelter to others whose cabins might not withstand the conditions. Lucas appreciated the irony. 6 months earlier, these men had mocked his fortress as a waste of effort. Now Victor was suggesting it might become a refuge. But Lucas did not point this out. He simply told Victor that anyone who needed shelter would be welcome. The fortress was large enough to accommodate a dozen people if necessary, and he had supplies that could be stretched to feed that many for several days if required. The storm arrived on January 23, 1882. It began gently, light snow falling straight down in the still air, but within hours the wind picked up and the snowfall intensified. By nightfall, visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. The blizzard had begun. The snow fell with an intensity Lucas had never witnessed. By midnight on January 23rd, 6 inches had accumulated. By dawn on the 24th, the depth had reached 18 inches of new snow on top of the existing base. The wind howled with a sound that was almost alive, a continuous roar punctuated by gusts that made the air itself visible as solid sheets of white. Temperature dropped to 20 below zero, and the wind chill made it impossible to survive outside for more than minutes. Inside the fortress, Lucas remained comfortable. He kept a small fire burning in the stone fireplace, using minimal wood because the thick walls retained heat so efficiently. The interior temperature held steady at 45 degrees. He could hear the wind outside, but felt no drafts. The door remained secure despite snow piling against it with increasing weight. The crenellated walls deflected the wind's force, creating turbulence that prevented pressure from building against any single point. By the second day, the snow depth outside had reached 4 feet of new accumulation. Lucas opened his door that morning to assess conditions and found a wall of snow that had drifted against the entrance. He pushed through it easily, the door's outward swing clearing a path. He stepped outside for less than a minute, long enough to confirm that visibility was zero and the storm showed no signs of diminishing. The wind drove snow horizontally with such force that exposed skin would freeze in seconds. He retreated inside and sealed the door. There was nothing to do but wait. He had food for weeks, firewood for months, and water from melting snow. The fortress protected him completely, but he thought about the other trappers scattered across the region in their log cabins. Those structures would be under immense strain. The weight of accumulating snow would test every roof. The wind would find every gap in the chinking. The cold would penetrate walls that relied on minimal insulation. By the third day, January 26th, the snow depth had reached 6 feet. The storm's intensity had not decreased. If anything, it had grown stronger. Lucas estimated wind speeds were exceeding 50 miles per hour based on the sound and the way the snow moved past his narrow observation slits. He could no longer open the door because snow had drifted against it to a depth of 8 feet. He was effectively sealed inside, but this did not concern him. He could dig out when the storm ended. What concerned him was the muffled sound he heard on the afternoon of the third day. It was distant, barely audible over the wind, but distinct. A human voice shouting. Then silence. Then the sound again, closer this time. Someone was outside in the storm, moving toward his fortress. Lucas grabbed his shovel and began digging through the snow that blocked his door. It took 20 minutes of hard work to create a tunnel through the drift. When he finally broke through to the surface, he saw a figure stumbling through the blizzard 50 yards away. The figure was Victor Havel, bent against the wind, moving with the determined shuffle of a man who knew that stopping meant death. Lucas shouted and waved, though the wind tore his voice away. Victor saw him and changed direction, struggling through thigh-deep snow toward the tunnel entrance Lucas had carved. When Victor reached the fortress, he collapsed just inside the door, ice coating his beard and eyebrows, his breathing ragged from exertion and cold exposure. Lucas pulled him fully inside and sealed the door. Victor lay on the floor for several minutes, simply breathing, while Lucas added wood to the fire and prepared hot broth from dried meat. When Victor could finally speak, the story came out in fragments. His cabin had collapsed an hour earlier. The roof had given way under the weight of snow, probably 7 feet accumulated on the structure by that point. The ridgepole had cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Then the entire roof had crashed down into the interior. Victor had been outside when it happened, briefly checking his woodpile. He had heard the crack and seen the collapse. His wife had been inside. Lucas felt his stomach drop, but Victor continued quickly. She had been in the loft, the small sleeping area built above the main floor. The loft had remained partially intact, even as the main roof collapsed. Victor had dug through the debris and pulled her out. She was alive but injured, her leg broken. He had splinted it with firewood and wrapped her in every blanket they owned, but their cabin was now uninhabitable, open to the storm, and his wife could not travel through the blizzard. Victor had left her in the partial shelter of the collapsed structure and come to get help. He needed to bring her to the fortress. It was the only structure within reachable distance that he knew would be standing. Lucas did not hesitate. He gathered rope, extra blankets, and a canvas tarp. The two men went back out into the storm. The journey to Victor's collapsed cabin took 40 minutes, though the distance was less than 200 yards. Visibility was measured in feet. They stayed connected by rope tied around their waists. Several times Victor lost his bearings and Lucas had to redirect him. The wind threatened to knock them down. The cold bit through their heavy clothing. When they finally reached the ruins of the cabin, they found Victor's wife, Anna, where he had left her, huddled under blankets in a corner where part of the loft structure provided minimal protection from the falling snow. They wrapped her in the canvas tarp and additional blankets, creating a cocoon that protected her from wind and cold. Lucas and Victor carried her between them, struggling back toward the fortress through conditions that were worsening. The return trip took over an hour. By the time they reached the tunnel entrance, all three were on the edge of hypothermia. They collapsed inside, and Lucas sealed the door behind them. Anna Havel's leg required immediate attention. The break was clean below the knee, but the splint Victor had applied in haste was inadequate. Lucas had basic medical knowledge gained from necessity rather than training. He reset the splint properly, using straight pine boards and leather straps, immobilizing the leg from ankle to mid-thigh. Anna bore the pain with minimal sound, biting down on a leather strap. When he finished, Lucas gave her willow bark tea for pain and positioned her on his sleeping platform with blankets and furs piled for warmth. The fortress now sheltered 3 people where Lucas had designed it for 1. But the space was adequate and the supplies sufficient. He calculated food stores and firewood and determined they could survive comfortably for 2 weeks, even if the storm continued that long. The thick walls meant heat loss was minimal. A fire that would have been inadequate in a log cabin kept the interior at a steady temperature above freezing, despite 3 people consuming that warmth. On the 4th day of the storm, January 27th, they heard voices outside again. Lucas opened the tunnel and found Joseph Dvorak and his brother Tomas standing in the blizzard. Joseph's chimney had failed, cracked by thermal stress, and smoke had filled their cabin, making it unbreathable. They had abandoned the structure and come to the fortress, knowing it was their only option. Lucas brought them inside without hesitation. Over the next 12 hours, more arrivals came. Milos Kovar and his wife appeared, their cabin buried under snowdrifts so deep they could not open the door or windows. They had dug an escape tunnel through a wall and made their way to the fortress by following the creek drainage. Two brothers named Pavel and Lubomir arrived together, their shared cabin crushed when a snow-laden tree had fallen across the roof. By the evening of the fourth day, 17 people crowded into the fortress. Every available space held someone. The sleeping platform accommodated 3 injured people, Anna Havel with her broken leg and 2 others with frostbite damage. The rest sat or lay on the floor, wrapped in whatever blankets and furs could be shared. The fire burned continuously, and Lucas rationed his firewood carefully, knowing they might need to sustain this population for days. The fortress performed beyond even Lucas's expectations. The thick snow walls insulated effectively enough that 17 bodies generated sufficient heat to keep the interior temperature comfortable even with minimal fire. The air remained breathable because the slight gaps around the doorframe allowed fresh air to enter, while the warm air rose and escaped through similar gaps near the roof. The system self-regulated, preventing both suffocation and excessive heat loss. On the 5th day, the storm finally began to diminish. The wind decreased and the snowfall became lighter. By evening, the sky cleared partially, revealing stars for the first time in 5 days. The blizzard had ended. Outside, snow depth exceeded 8 feet in the drifted areas, 5 feet where the wind had scoured the surface bare. The morning of January 29th brought clear sky and still air. The temperature remained well below zero, but without wind, the conditions were tolerable for brief periods outside. Lucas opened the door and dug through the snowdrift that had accumulated against it, creating a ramp that allowed access to the surface. The world outside had been transformed into an unrecognizable landscape of white, with only the tallest trees visible above the snow level. The 17 people who had taken refuge in the fortress began assessing the damage to their own structures. Victor and Joseph volunteered to make the rounds, checking on cabins whose occupants had not made it to the fortress. They returned 3 hours later with grim news. 8 cabins had been destroyed completely, roofs collapsed, or walls crushed. 3 more were severely damaged and uninhabitable without major repairs. Only 4 cabins remained intact and usable. The families whose homes had been destroyed faced a critical problem. Rebuilding would take weeks even under ideal conditions, and winter was far from over. They needed shelter immediately. The fortress could house them temporarily but not comfortably for an extended period. The crowding was manageable for a few days, but would become unbearable over weeks. Someone suggested that perhaps multiple families could rotate, some staying in the fortress while others occupied the intact cabins, sharing space and resources. Lucas proposed a different solution. He would teach them his snow block construction technique. The high snowfield still held abundant building material, and the recent storm had actually improved the snow quality through compression and consolidation. A crew of men working together could cut enough blocks in 2 days to build a basic shelter. The construction would go faster with multiple people than it had when Lucas worked alone, and crucially, the technique required no scarce resources. No logs needed to be cut and hauled. No expensive hardware was required for the basic structure. The men looked at each other with expressions mixing skepticism and desperate practicality. 6 months earlier, they had mocked this technique. But their own cabins lay crushed under snow while Lucas's fortress stood solid, having sheltered them through the worst storm in living memory. The evidence was irrefutable. Snow block construction worked. It worked better than log cabins in these specific conditions of extreme snow load and severe cold. Victor spoke first. He wanted to learn the technique. His cabin would need to be completely rebuilt regardless, so why not use the method that had proven itself? Joseph agreed. Then Milos, then the others. By midday, 11 men had committed to learning snow block construction and building new shelters using Lucas's methods. That afternoon, Lucas led the first group up to the high snowfield and demonstrated his cutting technique. He showed them how to score the surface, make the vertical cuts, then separate the blocks with the horizontal cut. He explained why the rough faces were superior to smooth ones, how the crystalline texture created mechanical grip between blocks. The blizzard's aftermath revealed destruction across the entire settlement. Of the 19 occupied structures in the region, only 4 log cabins remained fully intact and habitable. 8 had suffered catastrophic failure with roofs collapsed or walls crushed under snow weight. 7 more had sustained major damage that rendered them unsafe or uncomfortable for winter occupancy. The families whose homes had been destroyed faced the immediate challenge of rebuilding shelter while winter continued around them with at least 2 more months of freezing temperatures and potential storms ahead. Lucas's fortress became both refuge and training ground. Each morning, crews of men would gather inside the warm interior to receive instruction on snow block construction techniques. Lucas explained the principles methodically, treating his students with the same patience his father had shown when teaching him carpentry. He emphasized that precision mattered more than speed. A block cut carelessly would fracture under stress. A wall built hastily would fail when tested by wind or weight. But blocks cut to specification and walls built with attention to detail would create structures as reliable as the fortress that surrounded them as they learned. The first practice structure went up in 4 days. 6 men working together under Lucas's supervision built a shelter measuring 12 feet by 10 feet with 6-foot walls. The construction taught them the rhythm of the work, cutting blocks at the snowfield, transporting them to the building site, laying courses with mortar slurry between each block, building the double-wall design with loose snow packed in the cavity for additional insulation. The completed structure was crude compared to Lucas's fortress, lacking crenellations and sophisticated details, but it was solid and weatherproof and provided genuine protection. By mid-February, 5 new snow block shelters stood across the settlement. Each family customized their design based on their specific needs and the number of occupants. Victor Havel built a structure slightly larger than Lucas's original, incorporating what he had learned about corner reinforcement and door frame integration. Joseph Dvorak built a smaller version for himself and his brother, emphasizing simple functionality over architectural ambition. Milos Kovar added his wife's suggestions, creating interior storage alcoves and a more efficient chimney design. The community dynamic shifted during those weeks of shared labor and mutual dependence. The mockery that had characterized earlier interactions disappeared completely, replaced by respect born from practical results. Men who had called Lucas foolish 6 months earlier now sought his advice on construction details. The fortress that had been dismissed as a waste of effort was now recognized as a significant innovation that had saved lives and provided a solution to problems the traditional methods could not address. Spring arrived in late March with the characteristic sudden warming that marked seasonal transition in the high country. The snowblock structures began their slow deterioration as temperatures climbed above freezing during daylight hours. But the buildings had served their purpose, providing secure shelter through the most dangerous months. Some families chose to rebuild with logs once timber became accessible. Others, having experienced the advantages of snowblock construction firsthand, planned to build new snow fortresses the following autumn using refined techniques learned through the winter's experience and collaboration. The years following the Great Blizzard of 1882 saw snowblock construction techniques spread throughout the high-altitude settlements of Colorado and Wyoming. Trappers, prospectors, and early settlers working above 10,000 feet elevation began building winter structures using compressed snow rather than relying exclusively on scarce timber resources. The technique was particularly valuable in regions where trees grew slowly and sparsely, where hauling logs required enormous effort, and where the very abundance of snow that made survival difficult also provided the solution to shelter construction challenges that traditional methods struggled to address adequately. Lucas continued refining his methods through experimentation and observation. He discovered that blocks cut from north-facing snowfields above 11,000 feet remained solid through most summers, allowing year-round construction and maintenance. He developed improved mortar formulations using different ratios of water to snow, depending on ambient temperature. He designed ventilation systems that managed interior moisture without sacrificing heat retention. Each innovation was shared freely with anyone who asked. Lucas never attempted to profit from his techniques or claim exclusive knowledge. He understood that survival in the mountains depended on shared information and mutual support among people facing common challenges. By 1885, an estimated 30 snowblock structures existed across the Colorado and Wyoming high country. Some were simple shelters built in days. Others were elaborate fortresses that rivaled Lucas's original in size and sophistication. A prospector named Anders Nielsen built a snowblock warehouse near his silver claim that stored equipment and supplies through multiple seasons. A survey crew working above timberline constructed a base camp entirely from snowblocks that housed 12 men through a winter of mapping work in conditions that would have made traditional camping impossible. The structures saved lives in ways both dramatic and mundane. During the severe winter of 1887, another major blizzard struck the region. This time, families in snowblock shelters weathered the storm without casualties, while 3 trappers in log cabins died from exposure when their structures failed. The contrast was noted in newspapers as far away as Denver, and the snowblock technique gained recognition beyond the immediate mountain community as a legitimate frontier innovation rather than an eccentric experiment. Lucas himself left the high country in 1890. At 42 years old, he had spent 13 winters above 10,000 feet and felt ready for a less demanding life. He moved to a valley ranch at 7,000 feet elevation, where he raised sheep and lived quietly. He married in 1892, started a family, and became known in his community as a skilled carpenter and stonemason, rather than as the man who had built fortresses from snow. He died in June of 1893. From pneumonia, leaving behind a wife, 2 young children, and scattered across the high mountains, a legacy built from frozen water and careful thought. The fortresses stood for years after his death, some maintained and occupied, others abandoned but still intact, weathered monuments to what one man's obsession with survival had created when everyone else laughed at blocks of snow stacked like a child's dream of castles that could withstand the worst the wilderness offered.